To understand the challenges faced by blacks in the North during the Great Migration, consider these issues. So, you know what made me look up the issues of the North? Because everybody always, you hear about the Great Migration and how black people who were in the South, they faced overt racism, lynchings, and cruelty and extreme racism, and they made the North seem like it was the place to be and it was safe. It was where you could find freedom away from the extreme poverty and racism and feeling like you were overpowered by overseers. But I learned that was a lot really just a fantasy, a lot of talk, and what they faced when they went to the North wasn't really any better. And I believe I'm going to read some of the things that I had ran across. So they encountered racial discrimination in housing, leading to segregation in neighborhoods. They faced limited job opportunities, often relegated to low-paying, unskilled labor. They experienced violence and hostility from white residents in some areas. And they dealt with inadequate access to quality education and healthcare services and encountered systemic racism in law enforcement and judicial system. Struggled with cultural adjustment and community integration in new urban environments. There's more. So it talks about the Great Migration and the causes and the impacts, and when you read about it, it was between the years of 1910 to 1970. And so when I read about it, you know, we often hear people talk about it like it was a savior, it was the best thing in the world for blacks. However, there was more to that story in the Great Migration. And so the Great Migration was between 1910 and 1970. And so it was one of the largest movements of people in the U.S. history. Approximately 6 million black people moved from the American South to the northern, midwestern, and western states, roughly between the years of 1910 to 1970. So the driving force behind this movement was to escape racial violence, pursue economic and educational opportunities, and obtain freedom from the oppression of Jim Crow, essentially. So the Great Migration is often broken into two phases, coinciding with the participation and effects of the United States in both world wars. The first migration was 1910 to 1940, so it had black Southerners relocate to northern and midwestern cities, including New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. And when the war effort ramped up in 1917, more able-bodied men were sent off to Europe to fight, leaving their industrial jobs vacant. The labor supply was further strained with a decline in immigration from Europe and standing bans on peoples of color from other parts of the world. So all of this afforded the opportunity for the black population to be the labor supply in non-agricultural industries. So although the migrants found better jobs and fled the South entrenchment of Jim Crow, many African Americans faced injustices and difficulties after migrating. So there was this famous story that some people are aware of and some may not be. It was called Red Summer in 1919. It was rooted in tensions and prejudice that arose from white people having to adjust to the demographic changes in the local communities. In World War I until World War II, from that point on, it is estimated that about 2 million black people left the South for other parts of the country. And World War II brought an expansion to the nation's defense industry and many more jobs for African Americans and other locals, again encouraging the massive migration that was active all up until the 1970s. So during this period, more people moved north and further west to California, major cities including Oakland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, as well as Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington. Within 20 years of World War II, a further 3 million black people migrated throughout the U.S. So black people who migrated during the second phase of the migration, which is called the Great Migration, were met with housing discrimination localities and had started to implement restrictive covenants, redlining, and created segregated neighborhoods, but also served as a foundation for the existing racial disparities in wealth in the U.S. today, which we call the wealth gap. It held a lot of our families prior to us being adults now back. So records in the topic cover a majority are migratory information and trends captured by various branches and agencies of government, including employment and housing. There are also records reflecting cultural, social aspects of the lives of those who participated and were impacted by this great migration. So if you search, you can find more information about it. So that was short. Now I also read that blacks who already came in the earlier wave of migration, when they got settled in, they were also discriminative, or in a way they felt like that, you were going to take away what they already were partaking in. I read this. So it makes sense, because you have some people now today that you see who throw us under the bus. So that's why people question, how could another black person use classism or use prejudice against another black person if they think they got a lot of money in their pocket, if they're a grifter, like we see Candace Owens. We've seen so many others after. We've seen a lot of famous people who are in the entertainment world. They grift, or they just about the money. They're just about their bag. You've heard those terms. They're just about the paper. They're just about coming up. They don't really have any empathy or any care about other blacks making it out. They're just worried about only what they can get out of the whole thing, and from wherever they come from or whomever they are, you see them, they're ready and willing to throw you under the bus. You hear about Sambo, Uncle Tom's, Uncle Ruckus, see what Nicki Minaj is doing, even though she's not even a U.S. citizen. But you also see Candace Owens, you see some of these other people that are political pundits, that they kind of shift towards the right, and now you see them, they're kind of grifting back and forth, and then whatever is okay for them to make money, as long as they are lining their pockets, they'll throw their own people or own cultures under the bus. And so I was reading about that. I found that really interesting. So this was like more condensed. It was short and concise, so there's more into it. And so if you really pay attention to this still photo, this is a housing project. So a lot of times what had happened is a lot of these people were pushed into these housing projects, which now you see they're tearing a lot of them down and trying to recreate them, revamp them, or what they call, refurbish them. So I know that's happening in Watts. That's happening in some parts of the city here in LA County, where some of the housing projects, they're trying to redo them so that they can make them a little bit more modernized. But it's the same old housing projects. So I just felt that this was something that people should, maybe if you want to read about the Red Summer, that was also pretty much similar to what happened with the Black Wall Street, where people were, really, there was a lot of prejudice, a lot of tensions, and a lot of people were killed during that time. So I believe it was a really horrible race riot that took place, and so there's more to that. So so here it tells you causes and impacts and what had took place as well. So the Great Migration, that's why you see people who want to move and they want a better life. It was us. It was black people in the beginning who wanted a better life. And they were going to get it however they needed to. The Great Migration was a relocation of 6 million black Americans from rural southern areas, the rural south, to the cities of the north, midwest, and west from about 1916 to 1970, driven from their homes by unsatisfactory economic opportunities, harsh segregationist laws. Many black Americans headed north, where they took advantage of the need for industrial workers that arose during the First World War. So during the Great Migration, black people began to build new places for themselves in public life, actively confronting racial prejudice as well as economic, political, and social challenges to create a black urban culture that would exert enormous influence in the decades to come. So what caused this migration? It says historian Yohuru Williams explains the need to sound smart about Great Migration and African Americans from the South to the North after the Civil War. So it goes into it. After Civil War, Reconstruction era, racial inequality persisted across the South during the 1870s, and segregationist policies such as Jim Crow soon became the law of the land. Black Southerners were still forced to make their living working the land due to black codes. And so you need to look up what Jim Crow really is and what black codes are. And so black codes and the sharecropping system as well was in place, which offered little and no way economic opportunity, especially after crop damage resulting from regional boll weevil infestation in 1890s and early 1900s. So the KKK had been officially dissolved in 1869. The KKK continued underground after that. So even though they were dissolved, they still were a group, a hate group, and they still were around. They were just underground. And the intimidation and violence and the lynching of black Southerners were not uncommon practices in the Jim Crow South. And so that's why when black people go around saying we want segregation, we're already segregated. No, not to the effect that it was in Jim Crow South. No, you're not. You're pushed out of things, priced out of things. People look at you funny, but no, you're not being lynched, you're not being murdered. The only murder that we do see is the possibility of black people getting shot by police officers. And now you have ICE, which is another form of, to me, the KKK. It's just a new form of it. So around 1916, did you know the Great Migration began a factory wage in the urban north that was typically 3 times more than what black people could expect to make working the land in the rural south? So the Great Migration, it begins in World War I. When that broke out in Europe in 1914, industrialized urban areas in the North, Midwest, and West faced a shortage of industrial laborers. So this was the war that put the end to the steady tide of the European immigration to the U.S. So with war production kicking into high gear, it goes on to say that recruiters enticed black Americans to come north to the dismay of white Southerners. Black newspapers, particularly the widely read Chicago Defender, which I think is still in effect today, published advertisements touting the opportunities available in cities in the North and the West, along with first-person accounts of success. So life for migrants in the city. So by the end of 1919, some scholars estimate that 1 million black people had left the South, usually traveling by trains, boats, roads, bus. A smaller number had automobiles and even horse-drawn carts. So in the decade between 1910 and 1920, black population of major northern cities grew by large percentages, including New York 66%, Chicago 148%, Philadelphia 500%, and Detroit 611%. So many new arrivals found jobs in factories, slaughterhouses, foundries, where working conditions were arduous and sometimes dangerous. Female migrants had a harder time finding work, spurring heated competition for domestic labor positions. So aside from competition for employment, there was also competition for living space in increasingly crowded cities. While segregation was not legalized in the North, it was in the South. Racism and prejudice were nonetheless widespread. So after the U.S. Supreme Court declared racially based housing ordinances unconstitutional in 1917, some residential neighborhoods enacted covenants requiring white property owners to agree not to sell to black people. Sound familiar, doesn't it? Just like we see people not accepting Section 8 vouchers, people increasing rents unfairly, people evicting people because they're using the Ellis Act. Some of these things have not really gone away. And then I'm hearing that in local cities in LA County and abroad cities, some of those old redlining things that were listed for housing covenants were still in those documents, hadn't been erased. So they say, oh, we don't do this anymore, but you have to wonder. So these would remain legal until the court struck them down in 1948. So rising rents, listen to how this sounds eerily familiar to what is going on and similar to what is going on today. Rising rents in segregated areas, plus a resurgence of KKK activity after 1915 worsened black and white relations across the country. The summer of 1919 began the greatest period of interracial strife in the U.S. history at the time, including a disturbing wave of race riots. The most serious was the Chicago race riot in 1919, and it lasted 13 days and left 38 people dead, 537 injured, 1,000 black families without homes. So the impact of the Great Migration: as a result of housing tensions, many black residents ended up creating their own cities within big cities, fostering growth of a new urban black culture. The most prominent example was Harlem in New York City, formerly all-white neighborhood that by the 1920s housed 200,000 black people. So the black experience during the Great Migration became an important theme in the artistic movement, known first as the New Negro Movement and later as the Harlem Renaissance, which would have an enormous impact on the culture of that era. And so the Great Migration also a new era of increasing political activism among black Americans who, after being disenfranchised in the South, found a new place for themselves in public life in the cities of the North and the West. The civil rights movement directly benefited from this activism. So black migration slowed considerably in the 1930s, and when the country sank into the Great Depression, but picked up again in the coming of the World War II and the need for wartime production. But returning black soldiers, guess what happened to them? They found that the GI Bill didn't always promise the same post-war benefits for all. So by the 1970s, which the GI Bill promised, you could get like housing, you could get, opportunities that white soldiers got, black soldiers couldn't get it. So a lot of these young guys, these people around here that think they know everything, don't even read this. And they don't realize that your maybe great great grandparents who might have served didn't get the same wealth opportunities that their white counterparts did. So by the 1970s, the Great Migration ended. Its demographic impact was unmistakable. So whereas 1900, 9 out of every 10 black Americans lived in the South, and 3 out of every 4 lived on farms, and by 1970 the South was home to only half of the country's black population, with only 20% living in the region's rural areas. The Great Migration was famously captured in Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, an epic story of the America's Great Migration. So that's pretty much, in short, the history of the Great Migration. Since this is Black History Month, I felt this was an important piece to read about in Leon of what is going on. And I think this is a beautiful picture, and you can see all the hope and all of the promise in the eyes of this family. And notice it's a couple, a husband and a wife and their kids, and they've got a nice car and they want to have a good life. So we too, people in our families, were seeking the same thing, seeking a better life, and a lot of people don't realize that. And so we are the great 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 grandchildren of people who were doing similar back then. They were seeking a better life, and they were trying to get away from the Jim Crow South, and they were trying to get away from the racial prejudice, and they were trying to get away from the segregation, but only to be met with more racial prejudice and divide and social divide and economic downfall, and not being able to live in safe environments, being pushed in public housing, being pushed out of opportunities, being pushed out of building wealth, being met in the North with these covenants, these restrictive covenants, such as the redlining, and where you couldn't, even if you had the money to buy a home, you couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. You were firebombed out of those neighborhoods, or you were intimidated, or there were threats of lynchings, or you just didn't feel safe, and so then you had to go to an environment where everybody was pushed together, everybody's kind of struggling, and so that was what a lot of people were met with. And then you're also met with people who probably were already, they came in the first wave, so they didn't feel comfortable with having more black people encroach in their space, because they're feeling like, oh, now we're going to lose our opportunities. Yes, we had black people like that who felt like, oh, okay, now more black people are coming, now we're gonna, it's ruining our opportunities. Yes, that was happening, and I was reading that and I said, it makes sense, because you heard the term, some have heard the term, not all skin folk are kinfolk, and so that was going on as well. So, but a lot of that comes from, they learn that is learned behavior because of the discrimination they also too faced. So people tend to get like that. What you tend to hate happening to you, you then now become. And so that's what we're seeing, a lot of this happening now with housing discrimination, with the Section 8. It's just new people doing it. New people doing some of the same things that were happening, and we're seeing other migrations happen, where now you have black people talking about traveling abroad because they're afraid. Some of them, I've been hearing this, saying that they want to go and travel somewhere else to see if they can get opportunities, if they can pay less in rent or mortgage, if maybe they could acquire homes, maybe they could get better pay, or they could just live better, or they could flee the racism of the US. But you got to do your homework on those countries and what their problems are. Nowhere is perfect. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, pretty much. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. I heard a woman said that Her and a group of black people went to Ghana because they had opened up their country and were granting full citizenship to black Americans. I seen an article recently, because of all of the travel bans and all of the banning and the tariffs that have come from the US out of the Trump administration, that Ghana has now canceled that. That's what I saw, that they are no longer opening their citizenship up to black Americans. In fact, some might be in danger of having those citizenships that they currently acquired canceled, just like what has happened here. And I did see recently, and I read that Donald Trump's administration is trying to cancel and revoke naturalized citizenship and foreign-born Americans. People who have acquired citizenship through maybe naturalization, and they claim that it's fraud, that maybe they somehow were engaged in some kind of nefarious activities that granted them citizenship in the US, and that they were investigating all of these case-by-case situations, and that they were going to revoke these naturalized citizenship people that are here in the US. So a lot of them are set to lose their citizenship based on these issues, and then more. So you'd probably have to look those up. And then I'm hearing that kids are being detained, parents are being detained, some U.S. citizens are being detained, and then you might have to get a lawyer, and then it might be costly, and then you have to produce documents showing that you're a citizen, and then you could lose your job, or you could lose your whatever while you're being detained waiting to prove your case. There's a lot of things happening, and it's scary, and it's like they're shutting the door on the border and shutting the door on opportunities of people trying to look elsewhere. And if you look elsewhere, what also is being said is that you could run into a situation where your passport is flagged as stolen or lost, and you didn't even apply for that. You didn't even say it was stolen or lost. And I've been hearing those stories, that some black Americans that want to travel, they're doing all this stuff on TikTok, encouraging people to go to Thailand, go to China, go here. Oh, the opportunities are better. Oh, there are black people over here. Oh, you want to find yourself. Oh, you want to do this and this. That may be all well and good, but when you get to a certain place, it seems like everything is cool, and that next thing you know, you go somewhere and boom, your passport is said to be stolen. It is flagged, it has an alert on it, and it takes forever. And if you're in a bad situation where maybe the country is not as favorable to Americans, you don't know what you're going to get yourself into. If you get stuck in that, you might be stuck in limbo. You could get hurt. Anything. Worse than that, killed, kidnapped, murdered. You don't know what could happen, and this guy, he basically was warning people on TikTok to stop looking at those videos thinking, I'm gonna go peep over here in this country because I'm want to find better opportunities over here because the US has got all kind of drama going on. Be careful, people. You need to read, you need to do your homework. Reading is essential. Oh, what did they used to say back in the days? They said a mind is a terrible thing to waste, and a lot of people are doing just that. They are wasting all of their precious time. I mean, we see how ugly the Epstein stuff is. We knew this was happening. Get your mind off of that and get your mind on how these things right here could affect you. Housing, your basic needs. It's becoming a luxury just to have a place to live, let alone having food to eat, having shelter. Those are essential needs for everyone, and now it is now looked at as a luxury. This is nothing new. I'm just shedding some light here that this great migration, it was a purpose for this. These people were looking for a better life. These are black Americans, what they want to say, FBA, foundational black Americans, and black Americans in any situation for that context. I mean, Come on, y'all. This is scary. This is eerily similar. What was going on back then is happening now. But only now, I'm full aware that if we're seeing people getting shot in the street by ICE and there's no accountability and they can walk away from what they've done, and we're now being told that we have to look at a camera, we see what we see, but we didn't see what we see. It's propaganda and it's mental warfare, and it's also playing a part in our psyche. They're trying to normalize the sanctioned killings, normalize it, and that is what we're being fed. Just like back then when people knew lynchings were happening, yes, they were wrong, but you couldn't fight against it because the government was behind, it sanctioned it. It had to have, because Jim Crow was made law. And a part of Jim Crow was getting lynched, getting murdered, and those people who did the murdering were not held accountable. Much like what's happening with ICE. If you get killed because they said you tried to ram them with your car, when we see you trying to run away and flee away from ICE, no, they spin the story a whole nother way, and everybody's supposed to say, we saw what we saw and we saw it was wrong, but now we gotta retract what we saw because ICE said, because this Fox News said that it wasn't really what we saw. We're in a scary situation now. This is eerily similar to what was happening back then. You need to take note of this. Seriously.